She returned home at 2 in the morning after signing a billion-dollar contract overseas and found her husband in their bedroom with another woman. Not just any woman. It was his closest confidant, and that woman was wearing the silk robe Vivian Ashcroft had kept for 20 years. But Vivian didn't cry. She didn't scream. She took out her phone, recorded it all, and disappeared into the darkness. If you want to know what happens next, hit like and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far my story has gone. Now, let's begin. The flight home had been 11 hours of recycled air and the kind of silence Vivian had learned to fill with numbers, revenue projections, contract clauses, the offshore structuring of a $3.4 billion acquisition that she had spent the last 9 days carving out of the stubborn resistance of men who thought a woman in a boardroom was a decorative feature. She had won. She always won in rooms like that. The victory sat somewhere behind her sternum, quiet and dense, the way winds had started feeling in the last few years. Not like triumph, more like the successful closing of a wound. The car from the airfield took the mountain road. Vivian watched the headlights cut across the tree line, her phone dark in her lap, her coat still on. She had not called ahead. Alessandro had told her he would be in Palermo through Thursday. She had finished 2 days early. She thought briefly about calling the estate, about letting the household staff know she was coming, and then she let the thought go. She was in her own home. She did not announce herself in her own home. The gate recognized the car and swung open without sound. The driver pulled around the gravel crescent and stopped at the front entrance. Vivian got out before he could reach for her door. She took her carry-on herself. The estate was dark in the way of a house where someone has made an effort to appear unoccupied. A few lights burning on timers in the lower rooms, nothing on the second floor that should be on. She noticed it before she had a name for the feeling. A particular quality of stillness in the front hall. The security panel on the wall showed the internal cameras had been disabled, not the exterior perimeter. Alessandro would never be reckless enough to drop the perimeter, but the interior feed was dark. She stood in the doorway of the hall for 3 seconds, reading the silence the way she had learned to read rooms, and then she set her carry-on down against the wall and moved toward the staircase without making a sound. She had been in enough negotiating rooms to know what it felt like when someone was hiding something from her. The air changed. It had a particular density, a texture of careful concealment that you could learn to sense if you had spent enough years around people who lied as a professional skill. Alessandro had that skill. She had always known that. She had simply chosen, for a long time, to treat it as the cost of the life she had agreed to. The bedroom door was not fully closed. Vivian stood in the corridor and looked at the 2-inch gap and the thin bar of amber light leaking through it, and she felt something happen inside her chest. Not quite pain, more like the physical sensation of a belief system beginning to give way. She had suspected. Suspected was too clean a word, really. She had known, the way you know something you have spent considerable energy refusing to confirm. She had allowed herself the comfort of uncertainty. Standing in the corridor at 2:14 in the morning with 11 hours of flight behind her and a closed deal in her briefcase, she felt that comfort dissolve completely. She did not reach for the door immediately. She reached for her phone. She turned the volume off. She opened the camera. She pushed the door open with the flat of her hand. The room was lit by the lamp on Alessandro's side of the bed, the one with the heavy brass base that Vivian had selected from an estate sale in Lyon, a piece she had chosen because she liked the quality of the light it cast, warm and without harshness. In that warm light, on her side of the bed, Lila Moreau sat propped against the headboard with her legs crossed at the ankle and a glass of Vivian's wine on the nightstand beside her. She was wearing the silk robe, the one with the ivory hem and the hand-sewn closure that Vivian's mother had brought from Hanoi before Vivian was born. Alessandro was standing at the window with his back half turned, a cigarette between his fingers, the smoke pulling toward the cracked glass. He turned when the door opened. He did not look guilty. That was the first thing Vivian registered. He looked annoyed. "You weren't supposed to be back until Thursday," he said. It was not an explanation. It was not even the beginning of an apology. It was a correction. The reflexive irritation of a man whose plan had been disrupted by factors outside his control. Vivian kept the phone level and steady. She moved the frame slowly, deliberately, taking in the nightstand, the robe, the wine glass, the ashtray on the windowsill, the second glass, Alessandro's jacket on the chair, her own chair. Lila had not moved. She watched Vivian with an expression that was not quite shame and not quite defiance. Something calculated, something that measured the room and waited to understand which direction the power was flowing. She was 29 years old. She had been Alessandro's consigliere for 3 years, elevated past men who had earned their positions over decades, and Alessandro had said when Vivian asked about it that Lila had a mind for structure. A mind for structure. Vivian had not pushed further. "Don't do that," Alessandro said, looking at the phone. Vivian did not lower the phone. "I said don't do that, Vivian." "I heard you." She completed the slow pan of the room. She took 3 still images. She stepped back into the corridor. She pulled the door shut behind her, not slamming it, closing it with a careful, precise click, the way she closed every negotiation she intended to walk away from. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. She had the obscure, dissociated awareness that some part of her had been prepared for this, had been quietly preparing for a long time, had been filing away exits and contingencies the way you file away information you hope you never need. She walked back down the staircase, collected her carry-on from the hall, and left the house. The driver was still at the Crescent. He looked at her. She told him to take her to the Ashcroft property on the Eastern Ridge. He did not ask questions. That was something she valued about people who worked directly for her family rather than for the Moretti Syndicate. They understood that her instructions did not require context. In the car, she opened the document folder in her briefcase, not the acquisition papers, the ones underneath, the ones she had been quietly assembling for 4 months. The Ashcroft Family Council had sent her the first file at the end of February, flagged as a routine audit concern, and when she had read it the first time, she had set it face down on the desk and sat with the implications for a long time before she read it again. 2 days later, she had called her Uncle Brennan, who was the eldest active voice on the Ashcroft Council, and she had said to him, "I need to understand exactly how deep this goes before I do anything." Brennan had said, "Then we start from the bottom and we map it completely." That is what they had been doing since March. What she had now was not a suspicion. It was a structure, a documented structure of forged authorizations, fraudulent asset pledges, and a financial rerouting scheme that had been using the Ashcroft family's legitimate international holdings as the clean face of Alessandro's expansion into markets that the Commission had not sanctioned and would not have sanctioned. She had her name on documents she had never signed. She had her signature, replicated with accuracy that suggested either a very good forger or access to her original signature files, on authorization letters that had been used to pledge 3 of her family's estate holdings as security for loans taken out to finance operations that she had never been told about. He had been doing it for at least 2 years. She sat in the back of the car and looked at the files and felt something settle into place in her that she did not have a clean word for. Not anger, exactly. Anger was a temperature, a heat, something that flared and required management. This was colder. This was the particular lucidity that arrived when the last possible interpretation that could have excused the behavior was removed. The Ashcroft property was staffed overnight by a small household team that operated independent of anything connected to Alessandro. She had maintained that separation quietly, deliberately, over the course of years, in the same way she had maintained other separations that she hoped she would never need. Brennan was there when she arrived. He had not been called. He was simply there, with coffee on the kitchen table and the look of a man who had also been waiting a long time for something to break open. "It happened," she said. Brennan looked at her. He was 63 years old, large across the shoulders, with the careful manner of a man who had spent his life in rooms where the wrong word cost something real. "What do you need?" he said. She sat down. She put the files on the table. She poured her own coffee. "I need everything verified and time-stamped before morning," she said. "I need the council assembled by the end of the week. I need the financial holds activated on the secondary accounts. Not the primary, not yet. And I need you to find out who else on the inside knows about the forged signatures." Brennan sat down across from her. He opened the top file and looked at it without expression for a long moment. "You know he's going to frame this as you making a move against the syndicate," he said. "I know. He has the commission's ear right now. 3 of the senior capos owe him." "They owe him money and favors," Vivian said. "That's different from loyalty, and money and favors run in the direction of whoever controls the accounts." She set her coffee down. "He doesn't know I control the accounts." That was not quite true, and both of them understood it. Alessandro knew that Vivian managed the Ashcroft family's legitimate holdings. What he had never fully understood, what he had, in the particular arrogance of a man who had never been required to understand the operational infrastructure that kept him powerful, simply never bothered to examine, was the degree to which those legitimate holdings formed the financial skeleton of everything the Moretti Syndicate had built in the last 15 years. He had inherited a criminal organization with a reputation and a network and almost no clean money. He had married into one that had both, and had spent a decade treating the clean money as a resource without concerning himself with how it was maintained or who maintained it. Vivian had maintained it. She had done it quietly, without ceremony, without requiring that anyone notice. She had done it because it was what her family had sent her to do, and because she was genuinely skilled at it, and because she had believed for a long time in the possibility that Alessandro would prove to be something better than what he was. She had stopped believing that sometime around the middle of last year. She had continued to maintain the infrastructure anyway, because dismantling it carelessly would have hurt people who had nothing to do with what she was now prepared to call Alessandro's betrayal. She was not going to be careless. "Start with Capo Fernetti," she said. "He's been nervous for 3 months. Something made him nervous, and I don't think it was us. I think Alessandro showed him something he wasn't comfortable with. And if he's in it, then he's in it, and we'll deal with that when we know." She looked at the files. "I want a complete map. Everyone who knew, everyone who signed, everyone who benefited. I want it clean and documented, and I want it in a form that the commission can look at and not dispute." She paused. "This doesn't end with blood. I want to be clear about that now before anything else happens. No blood. Not because I'm squeamish, because blood is what he's expecting, and it's the only thing he knows how to defend against." Brennan looked at her for a moment. "He won't take this quietly." "I know. When he figures out what you're doing, he'll panic," Vivian said. "And panicking men make mistakes, and I'm going to be there when he makes them." She picked up her coffee. "But first I need to know the full extent of what he's done, because I think what we have is not the whole picture. I think there's something underneath the forgeries and the asset pledges, something he was building toward." Brennan turned to the second page of the file. He read for a moment, then he went still. "Vivian," he said, "I know. This document is the authorization to transfer controlling authority of the Moretti Syndicate out of the joint charter and into a single holder structure," she said, "with his name on it, and mine, in my handwriting that I did not write." She set her cup down very carefully. He wasn't just sleeping with her. He wasn't just using the accounts. He was building a case to have me removed from the charter, legally, according to the syndicate's own code. She looked at Brennan. He was going to use my own signature to erase me. The room was quiet. Outside, the first gray edge of morning was beginning to show above the ridge. "Then we don't have weeks," Brennan said. "No," Vivian said. "We have days. Maybe less if he figures out I've seen the files." She stood. "Get the council on the phone. All of them. Tonight." She picked up her briefcase. "And Brennan," he looked up. "Don't underestimate how far he's already taken this. Whatever you think the worst version is." Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from Alessandro's personal line. 4 words. "We need to talk." She turned the phone face down on the table. She looked at the morning coming in through the window, gray and without warmth, and she felt the cold clarity settle deeper into her chest like something that had finally found its correct position. "Assume it's worse than that," she finished. She did not respond to the text. She went to the window and looked out at the ridge and thought about the document she had read 4 months ago, the one that had started all of this, the one that had arrived in a routine audit folder and had turned out to be not routine at all. She thought about the 19 years of a marriage she had built carefully and in good faith, and the 11 hours of flight she had just completed, and the warm light of the brass lamp from Lyon, and Lila Moreau sitting in her bed in her mother's robe drinking her wine. She thought about the signature that wasn't hers. She thought about the word erase. 2 miles across the ridge, Alessandro Moretti was standing in the bedroom of his estate with a dead cigarette and a live problem, and he did not yet understand the nature of the problem he had. He thought it was a domestic crisis. He thought it was a complication that could be managed with the same combination of authority and charm that had managed complications his entire adult life. He thought Vivian was hurt and angry, and that hurt and angry women were a category of difficulty he had navigated before. He had not yet begun to understand that the woman who had walked into that room and walked out again without a word, without tears, without a single broken dish or raised voice, was not responding to what she had seen in that room. She had been ready for that. What she was responding to was the document, the signature, the plan to erase her. And she had known about it for 4 months. Across the ridge, Brennan was already on the phone. The Ashcroft Family Council was assembling with the particular quiet urgency of people who had been waiting for a signal and had now received it. Financial holds were being coded into systems Alessandro had never been given access to. Audit trails were being sealed. A thread was being pulled carefully from the outer edge of a fabric that Alessandro had spent 2 years weaving, and he was asleep in the bed where Vivian's mother's robe still lay folded over the chair. By the time he woke up and reached for his phone, 3 accounts he had been drawing from for 18 months would be frozen. He would not know it yet. He would only know that Vivian had not responded to his text. That would be the first thing that told him something had changed. But by then, the Ashcroft Council would already be 4 hours into dismantling everything he thought he owned, and Vivian Ashcroft, sitting at a window on the eastern ridge with cold coffee and 19 years of careful patience finally reaching its end, would be deciding which thread to pull next. Alessandro did not sleep after Vivian left. He stood at the window for a while, finishing the cigarette down to the filter, then he stood there a while longer without it. The room had taken on a particular quality of stillness that he did not like. The kind of stillness that had a weight to it, a pressure. The way silence sounds different when something has just changed and you do not yet know exactly what has changed or how much it costs. Lila had not moved from the bed. She was watching him with the careful attention she brought to everything, measuring him, reading the quality of his silence. She had that skill, the ability to read a room's emotional temperature with an accuracy that was almost clinical. It was the same skill that had made her useful to him. It occurred to him now, standing at the window, that a skill for reading people could run in multiple directions. "She's not going to come back tonight," Lila said. "I know that." She didn't say anything. That's the part that concerns me. He turned from the window. He looked at her in the way he looked at problems, directly, without the softening that he reserved for situations where softening was strategically useful. She was shocked. She needed air. Lila tilted her head slightly. She did not agree with him. He could see that she did not agree with him, and the fact that she was choosing not to say so told him something about where her mind was already going. "Vivian Ashcroft does not need air," she said carefully. "She's not that kind of woman. Don't tell me about my wife." "Someone should." She set the wine glass down. She had her phone out. She was recording. She was completely calm. She paused, and when she continued, her voice had dropped into the register she used when she wanted him to actually hear something. "Alessandro." She knew about the documents. The air in the room changed. He crossed to the bed in 4 steps. He stopped at the edge of it, looking down at her, and there was enough of something dangerous in his face that a lesser person would have moved backward. Lila held still. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying she knew before she walked in that door. The recording was not a reaction. It was a collection." She held his gaze. "She came home early on purpose." He stood very still for a moment. Then he walked to the chair where his jacket was, and he took his phone from the inside pocket, and he looked at the screen. No response from Vivian to his text. He looked at the time. It was 3:40 in the morning. He thought about the specific way she had moved through the room, the angle of the phone, the deliberate pace of it, the way she had pulled the door shut behind her like she was closing a file. He sat down in the chair with his jacket in his lap, and he was quiet for almost a full minute. "Wake up Soren," he said finally. "Tell him to come here." "Now?" "Right now, and get dressed." Lila got up from the bed without further argument. She found her clothes on the chair near the window and began to dress with her back to him, and Alessandro sat in the chair and thought about the document folder. The specific folder. The one containing the authority transfer papers and the authorization letters with Vivian's signature. He had kept those files in the estate's secondary office, a room that only he and Soren accessed. The room had a physical key and a digital lock. He thought about whether Vivian had ever had access to either. He thought about the fact that she had been conducting business abroad for 9 days. He thought about what 9 days was enough time to do if you already knew what you were looking for. His jaw tightened. By the time Marco Soren arrived at the estate, it was past 4 in the morning, and he had the look of a man who had been pulled from something comfortable and was managing his irritation through professionalism. He was 51, built like someone who had done physical work before he started doing this work, with a flattened nose and the permanently cautious expression of a man who had learned that surprises were rarely good. He was Alessandro's head of internal security and had been for 11 years. Alessandro trusted him the way he trusted machinery, completely, within a defined set of operating parameters. He sat Soren down in the study on the ground floor and told him what had happened in 3 sentences. Soren listened. He did not react visibly, which was one of his useful qualities. "The secondary office," Alessandro said. "I need to know if it's been accessed." Soren was quiet for a moment. "The digital lock logs accessed by keycard. If someone used a card that wasn't yours, I know how it works. I'm asking if you've checked the log recently." A pause. Something moved behind Soren's eyes. "Last week. It was clean." "Check it again. Now." Soren took out his phone. He navigated through several screens. Alessandro watched his face. He had become skilled at watching Soren's face over 11 years, and what he saw now was a man encountering information he was not prepared for. Soren's thumb stopped moving. His expression went through 3 distinct phases in the space of about 2 seconds. Surprise, calculation, something close to alarm, before he got it flat again. "There's an entry," Soren said. Alessandro felt the base of his spine go cold. "When?" "6 weeks ago, 3:17 in the morning." He looked up. "The card used was registered to the household systems account, the maintenance override." Alessandro stood up. He was not a man who paced. He walked to the window and put his hand flat on the glass and looked at the dark tree line. The maintenance override card was a master physical credential kept in a locked box in the estate's facilities room. He had never given it to Vivian. He had never given it to anyone except Soren. He turned and looked at Soren with a specific quality of attention, and Soren understood what the attention meant, and his chin came up. "It wasn't me," Soren said. His voice was flat and without apology. "Someone duplicated the card. Someone inside this house. Or someone with access to someone inside this house." They looked at each other. Alessandro thought about the household staff. He thought about who had been in the estate 6 weeks ago. He thought about Vivian, who had left for Zurich 10 days before her departure for the acquisition negotiations. He had been the one to book her flight, as a gesture, because she had mentioned the deal and he had wanted to appear supportive. And the specific memory of that now felt like swallowing something sharp. She had been here 6 weeks ago. "Find out who duplicated the card," he said. "Find out everything she accessed, and seal the secondary office. Change the lock today. Everything in there gets moved." He was already thinking beyond the immediate. "And I need to know where she is right now." Soren nodded once. He was on the phone before he reached the door. Alessandro stood alone in the study. He looked at the framed photograph on the desk. Him and Vivian at the Moretti family's anniversary dinner 3 years ago, her hand on his arm, both of them composed in the careful way of people who had learned that photographs were also a kind of document. He looked at it for a moment. Then he turned it face down. Vivian was at the Ashcroft property on the eastern ridge by the time Soren's man located her car. Alessandro received the information with his second coffee of the morning and felt the shape of the problem clarify in a way that did not improve his mood. The Ashcroft property was outside his operational reach. It was staffed by people who did not answer to him, who had never answered to him, who existed in a separate structure that he had always treated as background. The family money, the family history, the legal scaffolding that Vivian maintained with such quiet efficiency that it had become invisible to him. Background. He had made it background. He got Capo Fernetti on the phone at 6:15. Fernetti was 60, a heavy-set man with a careful manner and a history of surviving regime changes by never fully committing to any single faction until the outcome was clear. Alessandro had always understood this about him and had kept him useful by keeping him financially comfortable. The conversation lasted 4 minutes and told Alessandro almost nothing he wanted to know and several things he didn't. Fernetti was nervous, not in the way men were nervous when they had done something wrong and feared discovery, in the way they were nervous when they had seen something wrong and were waiting to understand whether loyalty to it was going to cost them. "Have you spoken to anyone in the last few days?" Alessandro said. "Anyone outside the usual channels?" "I don't know what you mean," Fernetti said. "Yes, you do." A silence. There were some questions about accounts, routine questions through an audit contact. Alessandro kept his voice even. "What accounts?" "The Ligurian transfers, the ones from the third quarter." Another silence. "I answered as I was instructed. I said they were standard operational expenses." "Who asked?" "An auditor from the Ashcroft Holding Group." Alessandro set the phone down on the desk very carefully. He did not end the call. He simply put it down and sat with his hands flat on the desk for a moment. The Ligurian transfers. Those were specifically the funds he had routed through the Ashcroft secondary accounts to finance the Kessler expansion, the operation he had not disclosed to the Commission because the Commission would not have approved it, because it pushed into territory that 3 other families considered theirs, and because Alessandro had decided that a done deal would be easier to defend than a proposal. He had used Vivian's account infrastructure to run the money. He had not told her. He had used the forged authorization to do it. She had known about the Ligurian transfers for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer. He picked the phone back up. "Fernetti, listen to me carefully. You say nothing to anyone about that conversation. You understand? Not to your own people, not to anyone." "Of course," Fernetti said, but his voice had this careful, airless quality of a man who was already calculating his position in a scenario where the landscape had shifted. Alessandro ended the call. He called Lila. She answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting. "He knows about the audit," Alessandro said. "I assumed he would figure it out." "I need you to find out what documents the Ashcroft Group has accessed through the holding company records. We have a contact at the filing registry." "I already tried," Lila said. The silence that followed had a specific texture. "The records were sealed at 4:30 this morning. External access has been restricted. Someone put a hold on the entire file index." 4:30, 90 minutes after Vivian had left the estate. He exhaled slowly. "She's faster than I thought." "I've been trying to tell you that," Lila said, and her voice held something he did not appreciate. Not quite "I told you so," more like the precise observation of a woman who had been waiting for him to catch up. "Don't," he said. "I'm not doing anything. I'm telling you what the situation is." "The situation is manageable." Another silence, longer this time. "Alessandro, she has the documents, the ones from the secondary office. She has the authorization letters. She knows about the signatures." A beat. "She's not going to come to you and cry. She is going to take this to the Commission." He knew that. He had known it since Soren showed him the door log. He had been running the counter-strategy in the back of his mind since before the sun came up. Who on the Commission owed him? Who could be moved? How the narrative of Vivian's actions could be shaped into something that put her on the defensive before she could put him there. He had done it before in different configurations. He was skilled at it. He thought about what it would take to get in front of this. To move first. To present Vivian's actions as an internal power grab by an Ashcroft heir who had decided to leverage a marital dispute into a hostile takeover of the syndicate. It was not completely false. The Ashcroft family had always had an interest in the syndicate's financial infrastructure. That interest could be framed as an ambition. Vivian's coolness, her speed, her apparent preparation, those could be framed as premeditation, as conspiracy. He had 3 capos who would support that framing if he called in the right obligations. He had a media contact who had been useful in exactly this kind of situation before. He started making calls. By noon, he had spoken to 4 capos, 2 commission liaisons, and a journalist who covered business and crime, with the particular flexibility of a man who understood that those 2 categories overlapped more than most people admitted. By early afternoon, the first quiet suggestion was moving through the syndicate's internal network, that Vivian Ashcroft, leveraging a private marital dispute, had initiated unauthorized access to sensitive syndicate documents and had begun a unilateral move to claim executive authority over the organization's financial structure, in violation of the joint charter. He watched it spread the way he watched all information spread, tracking where it landed, how it changed shape, which capos it alarmed and which it confirmed in their existing suspicions. He did not expect the call from Capo Renata Voss. Voss was 64, one of the commission's senior members, a woman who had held her position for 22 years through a combination of absolute competence and the particular ability to remain neutral in disputes until the moment when neutrality became a liability. She ran the Northeastern Territories, and she had never owed Alessandro anything, which was something he had always found mildly annoying and mildly reassuring in equal measure. She called him at 3 in the afternoon, and her voice was the voice of someone who had already decided something. "Alessandro, I've heard the story you've been telling today. It's not a story. It's a concern I'm raising with the commission." "It's a story," she said, without heat. "I've been in this organization long enough to know what a preemptive narrative looks like." She paused. "I've also had a call this morning from the Ashcroft Council, from Brennan Ashcroft." He kept his voice level. And he provided me with documentation, quite a lot of documentation." She was quiet for a moment. "I haven't looked at all of it yet, but what I've seen is concerning, Alessandro. The word I would use is concerning. Whatever Brennan Ashcroft has provided has been assembled by a family with a financial interest in taking control of— It has your signature on it," she said, "on the commission letters, the ones describing the Kessler operation." A beat. "The commission letters that were never sent to the commission." He did not respond immediately. He was thinking very fast. "I'm not making a judgment today," Voss said, "but I want you to know that the commission is aware that documentation exists, and I want you to understand that the story you've been telling today about your wife conducting an unauthorized power seizure, it's going to need considerably more support than you've given it so far if it's going to hold in a formal session." Her voice did not change pitch or temperature throughout any of this. "You might want to speak with the council." She ended the call. Alessandro sat in the study with the dead phone in his hand. Across the estate somewhere, Soren was still running down the card duplication. Lila was in the guest wing working her contacts. The machine he had built over 20 years was still running, still functional, still loyal in the mechanical way that organizations were loyal, until they understood that loyalty to him was going to cost them more than loyalty to his replacement. He thought about Voss's voice, the specific flatness of it, the absence of alarm, the way she had said concerning as if it were a complete sentence. He thought about the documentation Brennan Ashcroft had delivered to her at some point that morning, 4 hours before Alessandro had finished making his calls, which meant Vivian had been moving on the commission before he had even known she was going to move on the commission, which meant she had not decided to act in response to last night. She had decided weeks ago. He stood up. He walked to the window. He looked at the ridge on the eastern side of the property, and in the gathering flat light of the late afternoon, he thought about 19 years of marriage and the woman at the end of them, sitting in the Ashcroft house with her uncle and her files and her frozen accounts and her 4-month head start, and he thought about the way she had moved through the bedroom with the phone steady in her hand, and he thought about what Lila had said. She knew before she walked in that door. His phone rang. Soren. "The card," Soren said. "We found who duplicated it." "Who?" A pause that lasted slightly too long. "It was one of ours, one of the internal staff. He's been with the estate for 6 years." Another pause. "Alessandro. He's not talking to us anymore. He left the property this morning with a personal bag. His quarters are cleaned out." Soren's voice was careful in the way of a man delivering news in front of his own reflection, watching himself deliver it. "He had a secondary employment arrangement that we're only finding now. He was on payroll for the Ashcroft Group, has been for 8 months. Alessandro closed his eyes. 8 months. Someone inside his own estate, inside his own staff, reporting to the Ashcroft family for 8 months. Which meant they had not just accessed the documents 6 weeks ago. They had been watching for 8 months. They had been building a picture for 8 months. Every movement in the secondary office, every access, every document. He opened his eyes. Outside, the light was failing. In 6 hours, the Commission's secure channel would carry the notification that Renata Voss had confirmed that the Moretti-Ashcroft matter had been formally escalated to a full Commission review, that all parties were expected to produce documentation, and that the Commission would convene within the week to hear the case. Alessandro Moretti had spent 20 years building an empire on the certainty that he was the most dangerous person in any room he entered. He had built that certainty carefully, deliberately, on the bones of men who had underestimated what he was willing to do. He had not, until this moment, considered the possibility that his wife had spent 19 years building something with the same deliberateness, that she had not been background, that she had never been background, that the room he thought he owned had always, in every way that actually mattered. The Commission's formal notification arrived on the secure channel at 11:47 that night, and Vivian read it twice at the kitchen table of the Ashcroft property, with Brennan standing behind her and the overhead light making everything look the color of old paper. The language was procedural, clipped, the kind of language that had been written and rewritten over decades to say very serious things in the flattest possible register. All parties were required to present documentation at a full Commission session. The session would convene in 5 days at a neutral location to be confirmed. Pending the session, all executive decisions affecting joint charter operations were to be suspended. All parties. That last part was the part she read twice. "He moved faster than I expected on the Commission liaisons," she said. "He's been building those relationships for 3 years," Brennan said, "since before the Kessler situation. He was preparing for this even then." She set the notification down. It was not a question. She was reorganizing a picture she had thought she understood, adding a layer of premeditation she had not fully accounted for. Alessandro had not simply responded to an opportunity. He had been building toward a specific outcome for years, and the forgeries and the account routing and the authority transfer documents were not recklessness. They were a timetable. She needed to know what the timetable was. She got 4 hours of sleep on the couch in the Ashcroft study, fully dressed, and was back at the table by 5:30 with coffee and the account ledgers that the council's financial team had been working through since midnight. The ledgers were dense with the particular ugliness of money that had been moved in careful, layered increments to avoid the appearance of what it actually was. She had been working through versions of these records for 4 months, and she still found new textures of contempt for the craftsmanship every time she looked at them. At 6:40, her phone rang. Number she did not recognize. She answered it. The voice on the other end was Lila Moreau's. Vivian did not speak for a moment. She looked at Brennan across the table. He read her face and went still. "How did you get this number?" Vivian said. "The same way I get most things," Lila said. Her voice was different from the last time Vivian had heard it, which was 3 years ago at a syndicate dinner, a social occasion. And Lila had spoken with the careful warmth of a woman managing her presentation in a room full of people who mattered. This voice was stripped of that, flat, precise, the voice of someone who had decided that performance was no longer useful. "I need to meet with you. You're calling me from an unregistered number at 6:40 in the morning to ask for a meeting. Yes? Give me one reason." A pause. Not a theatrical pause. A pause that had weight to it. The pause of someone who had been sitting with something for a long time and was now picking up the cost of it. "Because I have the financial ledgers," Lila said. "The real ones, not the versions that were presented to the account managers. The originals, with Alessandro's margin notes. The ones that document every decision point in the Kessler routing." Another pause. "And the correspondence between Alessandro and Commission Liaison Havel, starting 2 years ago." Vivian set her coffee down very slowly. She looked at Brennan. He was watching her with the careful attention of a man trying to read a situation through one side of a conversation. "Havel," Vivian said. Yes. Senior Commission Liaison Gregor Havel had been Alessandro's most vocal supporter on the commission for the past 18 months. He had been the one to receive Alessandro's initial framing of Vivian's actions as an unauthorized power seizure and had been the first to formally register that framing with the commission's procedural record. He was also, according to Vivian's own intelligence, not a man who moved on principle. He moved on arrangement. "What kind of correspondence?" Vivian said. "The kind that explains why he's been supporting Alessandro's position on the commission," Lila said, "and the kind that explains what Alessandro promised him in exchange." A beat. Vivian. He promised him the Ashcroft Eastern Holdings, specifically, as a transfer of authority post-charter restructure. Her voice did not change pitch. He was selling your family's property to a commission official to buy the votes he needed to remove you. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird was doing something in the tree near the east-facing window, a small, insistent sound that Vivian was distantly aware of as a thing happening in a world that was continuing to operate normally, while the floor of the one she was standing on continued to open beneath her. "When can you meet?" Vivian said. They met at a location Vivian chose, a property the Ashcroft family maintained for legal consultations, a neutral ground, a room with no aesthetic identity, just a table and chairs and the kind of afternoon light that came through frosted glass and landed on everything without warmth. Brennan was there. 2 members of the Ashcroft Council's legal team were there. Vivian sat at the head of the table and waited. Lila came alone. She looked different outside the context of Alessandro's estate. Smaller in the shoulders somehow, though she was not a small woman. She was dressed without the careful precision Vivian associated with her. A dark coat, no jewelry, hair pulled back without artistry. She sat down across the table from Vivian and put a sealed document case on the table between them and did not immediately speak. Vivian looked at her. Not at the document case. At her. Lila met her gaze. There was something in it that Vivian had not expected. Not guilt exactly, and not the calculating assessment she had braced for. Something more worn than either of those. The look of someone who had been carrying something at a cost they had not initially anticipated. "Before I open that," Vivian said, nodding at the case, "I want to understand why." Lila was quiet for a moment. Her hands were flat on the table. "Why I'm here. Why you're here. Why now? Why not 6 months ago when this could have been stopped before the commission involvement?" Vivian's voice was even. She had decided before this meeting that she would not perform anger at this woman. Anger was a resource, and she was being careful with her resources. "Why not before the forgeries? Why not when you first understood what he was planning?" A silence. Lila's jaw moved once. "Because I thought I was part of the plan," she said. "I thought when the charter restructured, my position would be protected, that what we had—" She stopped. She started again, differently, with less of whatever had been underneath that sentence. "I was wrong about what I was to him. I understood that clearly this week, when he told 3 capos that if the commission asked about the authorization letters, the most likely source of the forgeries was his consigliere acting without his knowledge." The room was very still. "He offered you as the scapegoat," Brennan said. "He didn't offer me," Lila said. "He constructed me. There are documents in that case that have my signature on them. Documents I did sign, at his direction, that I was told were routine administrative filings." She looked at Vivian. "I signed them because he asked me to. I didn't know what they were attached to, and now he's prepared to tell the commission that I acted alone, that the forgeries were my initiative, that he had no knowledge." Her voice had been flat throughout this, but something was happening at the edge of it, something controlled with effort. He has a version of this story in which he is the wronged party twice. His consigliere exceeded her authority. His wife reacted with a campaign to seize the syndicate. He is the reasonable man surrounded by disloyal women. Vivian looked at the document case. "Open it," she said. Lila broke the seal and slid the case across the table. The council's legal team moved immediately. Vivian watched their faces as they worked through the documents, the way a certain kind of information registered in experienced professionals, a slight controlled widening of attention, A slowing of the page turns as the magnitude of what they were reading required more processing time. One of the lawyers, a woman named Carla, who had been with the Ashcroft Group for 14 years, set down the third document and looked at Vivian with an expression that Vivian had not seen on her face before. "These are originals," Carla said. "Yes," Lila said. "The margin notes are in Alessandro's handwriting." Carla looked back at the document. "This is a communication to Havel from 14 months ago. It's discussing the commission seat reallocation, the one that happened last spring when Capo Dreisen retired unexpectedly." She looked up again. "This suggests that Dreisen's retirement was not voluntary." The table went quiet in a specific way. Vivian looked at Carla. "What does it suggest specifically?" "It suggests that Dreisen was given documentation of a historical financial irregularity and advised that the commission would be reviewing his territory if he did not step down. It suggests that Alessandro provided that documentation to Havel, and that Havel used it to pressure Dreisen, and that in exchange for the seat vacancy, which was filled by one of Alessandro's allied capos, Alessandro pledged Havel the first tranche of the Eastern Holdings transfer." Carla set the document down very carefully. "This isn't just the Kessler routing and the forgeries. This is a commission manipulation that's been running for over a year." Vivian sat with that for a moment. She had known about the forgeries. She had known about the asset pledges. She had known about the Kessler expansion. She had not known about Dreisen. She had not known the commission manipulation went back 14 months and had already resulted in a structural change to the commission's composition. She had thought she had the full picture. She did not have the full picture. "How many other capos?" she said to Lila. "How many besides Havel?" Lila reached into the case and pulled out a second sealed envelope. She put it on the table. "3 liaisons," she said, "and 1 active capo who was recruited 6 months ago. There's a document in there that describes what he was offered." She paused. "It's your family's legal representation contract. Alessandro was going to hand over the Ashcroft Group's legal infrastructure as a transfer asset." Vivian looked at the envelope. She did not reach for it immediately. She was doing something internal that required her to not move for a moment. A recalibration, a reassessment of a situation she had thought she had mapped completely and was now discovering had additional dimensions she had not accounted for. She had been preparing for a commission session in which her documentation versus Alessandro's narrative would determine the outcome. She had believed her documentation was comprehensive. She had believed she understood the opposition. She had been preparing for a different fight than the one she was actually in. Alessandro had not simply been covering the Kessler operation and protecting himself from the forgeries. He had been systematically restructuring the commission itself. He had been buying positions, pressuring retirements, placing allied capos, bribing liaisons with assets that were not his to give. By the time the formal session convened in 5 days, the body that was supposed to evaluate the evidence and deliver an impartial judgment would be a body that he had been reshaping for over a year to ensure a specific outcome. She had walked into this believing she had the stronger case. She had the stronger case, and it was going to be heard by a room he had already arranged. She reached for the envelope. She opened it. She read the document inside. She read it once, and then she put it flat on the table, and she looked at the frosted window, and she allowed herself exactly the amount of time it took to exhale slowly to feel the full weight of what she was looking at before she put the weight down and started working the problem. "He has the votes," she said. It was not a question. Carla was quiet for a moment. With the restructured commission and with Havel in the chair for the session, yes, even with your documentation, the session outcome could be predetermined. She paused. He just needs to hold the narrative long enough for the session to deliver a finding. After that, any further challenge goes through an appeals process that he also controls. Vivian looked at Lila. "Is there more? Is this everything you have?" "There's more," Lila said, "but it's encrypted. Alessandro kept the most sensitive correspondence on an air-gapped system. I have a partial key. I couldn't get the full decryption before I left." She held Vivian's gaze. "I left quickly. I didn't have a lot of time to be thorough. Can you get the rest?" A silence that was longer than Vivian wanted it to be. "Maybe," Lila said, "if I still have remote access to the estate's secondary server. He might have shut it down by now." She paused. "There's also the question of what happens to me." If I access that system and he knows I've done it, then you need to access it before he knows you've done it, Vivian said. Her voice was not unkind. It was simply direct in the way that the situation required directness. Lila, I understand your position. I understand what you risked to come here. But if what you've brought me is everything there is, then in 5 days this commission session becomes a proceeding in which he has already bought the verdict, and the documentation I have, which is comprehensive and damning and absolutely true, does not matter. She leaned forward slightly. I need what's in that encrypted system, and I need it before the session. Lila looked at her hands. Her jaw was tight. There was a long moment in which Vivian could see her calculating the specific weight of what was being asked against the specific weight of her situation, and it was not a comfortable calculation to watch someone make. If I do this, Lila said, and the session goes the way you're describing it could go, I have no protection. Alessandro has already positioned me as the source of the forgeries. If he wins the session, I'm the one the commission comes for. Yes, Vivian said, that's accurate. And if I help you and you win, then the commission will be looking at a restructured evidence picture that implicates him and Havel and 3 liaisons and an active capo, and your cooperation will be documented and on record. Vivian's voice was even. I'm not going to promise you a clean exit. I'm going to promise you that what you bring me will be used and that your role in bringing it will be part of the record. She paused. That's the best I have for you. I'm not going to dress it up. Lila looked at her. A long look, the kind that was reading something. He told me you were soft, she said. He said you were the quiet money, that you didn't understand how the organization actually worked. I know he said that. He was wrong. I know that too. Another silence. Lila reached into the inside pocket of her coat and put a flash drive on the table. The partial key is on there. If the remote access still works, the decryption will take the system about 4 hours. She stood. She buttoned her coat. I'll try tonight. If the access is gone, I'll tell you by morning. She paused. And if it's gone, if he's already shut it down, then you should know that there's one more thing, something I haven't put in the documentation because I couldn't verify it. Vivian looked up at her. The vote count, Lila said. The 5-day window before the session. Alessandro didn't choose that window for procedural reasons. He chose it because there's a commission rule, an old one, rarely invoked, that allows a sitting Don to request emergency ratification of a charter change if a formal challenge is already in session. Her voice was careful now, precise. If the session opens and he moves for emergency ratification in the first hour, before your documentation has been formally entered, the commission can vote on the charter restructure without reviewing the evidence. The vote just needs a simple majority. She looked at Vivian with the direct, exhausted honesty of a woman who had spent too long in a room with a man who was smarter about tactics than she had been willing to admit. He's not planning to defend himself at that session, Vivian. He's planning to use the session itself as the mechanism. He calls the emergency ratification, Havel chairs the vote, and before anyone reads a single document, he's the sole authority holder of the Moretti Syndicate. Your charter rights are dissolved, and your family's assets are already legally pledged to the restructure. The afternoon light through the frosted glass had not changed. The bird outside had stopped. Carla and the other lawyer were very still. Vivian sat with the information in the particular way she had learned to sit with information that changed the shape of the problem she was solving, not reacting to it, not allowing it to become panic, but integrating it into a revised picture with the cold efficiency of someone who understood that the quality of the next decision mattered more than the loudness of the current feeling. She had 5 days. She had documentation. She had Lila's partial key. She had a commission session that had been engineered to destroy her before the evidence could speak. And she had one thing that Alessandro, in all his careful tactical building, had not accounted for. She knew about the emergency ratification rule before the session opened. She looked at Carla. The rule requires the motion to be seconded by an active capo before the chair can call the vote, she said. It was not a question. She had read the commission charter 4 months ago when she first began preparing, had read every procedural mechanism it contained, had read it with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the rules of any organization were also its vulnerabilities. Carla pulled up the charter on her tablet. She found the rule. She read it. She looked up. Yes, It requires a second from an active capo currently in good standing. And if the seconding capo's standing is in question at the time of the motion. Carla read further. A pause. The motion fails automatically. It can't be reintroduced in the same session. Vivian nodded once. She looked at Brennan. He was already ahead of her, already seeing the shape of what she was building, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man watching someone find a path through terrain he had thought was impassable. Capo Fernetti, she said. He's nervous, Brennan said. He's been nervous since the audit questions. He's nervous because he knows what Alessandro used those accounts for, and he knows that if this goes wrong, proximity is its own form of guilt. She stood. I need to speak with Fernetti. Tonight. Not through intermediaries. She picked up the flash drive. She put it in her inside pocket. And I need to know which capo Alessandro has lined up to second the ratification motion. She looked at Lila, who was still standing by the door with her coat buttoned. Do you know who he's planning to use? Lila's expression shifted slightly. Capo Renner, she said. He was recruited 6 months ago, the one in the document. The one who was promised the Ashcroft legal infrastructure. Vivian looked at the document on the table, the one with Renner's name on it, the one with Alessandro's margin notes and Havel's countersignature, the one that was, in the language of the Commission's own code, a record of an official being offered a bribe by the sitting Don. She looked at it for a moment. Then Renner's standing is exactly what needs to be in question before that session opens, she said. She picked up the document. She looked at Carla. How quickly can we get this in front of the Commission's Integrity Board? Carla looked at the document. She looked at the clock. She looked at Vivian with the expression of someone calculating a very tight margin against a very serious consequence if the calculation was wrong. If we file tonight, and if the board responds within their required 48-hour window, they'll respond, Vivian said, because if they don't, the document becomes evidence that the board itself was compromised, and no one on that board wants to be part of that record. She looked around the table. File tonight. Everything. The Kessler routing, the forgeries, the Havel correspondence, the Dreisen pressure, and the Renner bribe document. She paused. All of it goes in tonight. We don't hold anything back. We don't manage the release. We put it all in front of everybody that has authority to act on it, and we do it simultaneously, so there's no single point where Alessandro can apply pressure to slow it down. The room was quiet. Lila, at the door, said, He's going to know by morning. Yes, Vivian said. He is. And when he knows, he'll panic, Vivian said. For the first time in the entire meeting, something moved in her face that was not calculation or control. Something small and cold and without pleasure, the expression of a woman who had been told by her husband's own strategy that she was soft, that she was quiet money, that she didn't understand how the organization worked, and who had spent the night in a windowless room discovering the full depth of what he had built against her, and who had now found the single structural weakness in that building and was prepared to put everything she had into it. And panicking men make mistakes, she said. I said that 3 days ago, and it's still true. The difference is that now we're out of time for the slow version. She looked at the table one last time, at the documents, at the flash drive case, at the open envelope with Renner's name on it. She thought about the signature that wasn't hers. She thought about the word erase. She thought about 5 days in a room he had already arranged, and an emergency ratification motion that was designed to end her before she could speak. She thought about what Lila had said. He was wrong. Get Fernetti on the phone, she said to Brennan, and tell Carla's team to start filing. We have about 6 hours before the filing went in at 11:53 that night. Carla's team had worked without stopping for 5 hours, sequencing the documents in the order that told the clearest story. Not the most dramatic order, not the order designed for maximum emotional impact, but the order that built the logical structure brick by brick so that anyone reading it would arrive at the conclusion before they were told what the conclusion was. The Kessler routing first, then the authorization letters with the forged signatures, then the Havel correspondence in chronological sequence, then the Dreisen pressure documentation, then the Renner bribe. Last, the Commission charter violations. The specific clauses Alessandro had broken, cited by article number, cross-referenced to the documents that demonstrated the breach. Vivian had read the final filing package twice before Carla submitted it. Then she had signed the cover letter with her own name, in her own handwriting, and she had looked at her signature for a moment before she let it go. The Integrity Board acknowledgement came back at 12:41, automated, procedural, confirming receipt and initiating the 48-hour review window. It was a machine responding to a filing. It told her nothing about what happened next. She put the phone down and looked at the ceiling of the Ashcroft study and allowed herself 4 minutes of something that was not quite rest. A suspension of the forward pressure, a moment in which she was not yet in the next thing. Then Brennan came in and said Fernetti was on the phone, and she sat up and picked up the receiver. Fernetti sounded the way she expected him to sound at 1 a.m, with the weight of what he knew pressing down on him. Tired, cautious, with the particular vocal quality of a man who had been sitting in the dark with his options and had not found any of them comfortable. "Mrs. Moretti," he said, and then seemed to realize the choice of name was wrong, and stopped. "Vivian," she said, "you can use my name." "Vivian." A pause. He breathed. "I understand you filed with the Integrity Board." "Tonight, yes." "Alessandro will know by morning." "I expect so." Another pause, longer. She could hear him thinking, the specific silence of a man trying to find the angle that kept him safest. She understood that instinct. She did not have patience for it tonight. "Fernetti, I'm not calling to negotiate your position. I'm calling to tell you what the landscape looks like and let you decide what you do with it." She kept her voice flat and direct. "The documentation we filed includes the Ligurian transfers. Your name is in the account records as the administrative contact on the operational expense filings. I don't believe you knew the full scope of what those funds were for. I believe you were told they were standard, and you filed them as standard because Alessandro asked you to, and because his ask carried weight, you weren't in a position to refuse." She paused. "If I'm wrong about that, tell me now." Silence. "You're not wrong," Fernetti said. His voice had changed. The caution was still there, but something underneath it had given way. The particular relief of a man who has been told that the person across from him already understands the thing he has been most afraid to say. "He told me it was operational. I had questions and he made it clear that questions were not productive. I know how he makes things clear." She looked at the table. "Here's what I need from you. At the commission session in 4 days, Alessandro is going to move for emergency ratification of a charter restructure in the first hour. He needs a second from an active capo. He has Renner lined up. Renner's standing will be under formal review by the Integrity Board before the session opens, which means his second is void and the motion fails." She paused. "But Alessandro will be prepared for that. He'll have a backup, someone he can call on in the room if Renner's unavailable." She let the next words land deliberately. "I need to know who the backup is." Fernetti was quiet for a moment, then, "Capo Drac." She had not expected Drac. Drac was 67, old line, had been with the commission since before Alessandro's tenure. He had always presented as ideologically conservative, a man who valued procedural stability above personal loyalty. Alessandro had gotten to him, and that meant Alessandro had offered him something that spoke to what Drac actually valued, which was not money and was not territory. "What did he promise Drac?" she said. "The chair," Fernetti said quietly. "After Havel. He promised him the commission chair." She pressed 2 fingers against her eyes for a moment. The commission chair. The single most procedurally powerful position in the organization. The seat that controlled session order and evidence sequencing and the formal record. Alessandro had not just been buying votes. He had been buying the entire architecture of the adjudication process piece by piece, and he had been doing it with assets and positions that were not his to give. The Ashcroft holdings, the chair, the structure of the commission itself, offered out like furniture from a house he did not own. "Can you get to Drac before the session?" she said. "I don't know. Fernetti stopped, started again. "He's committed. Whatever Alessandro showed him, it was enough." "Then I need to be in that room before Alessandro moves," she said. "I need the floor before he can introduce the motion." She thought fast. The commission rules gave the floor first to the party who had filed the most recent formal challenge. and the Ashcroft filing submitted tonight was the most recent formal challenge on record. She had the floor first. That was the rule. Whether Havel honored it was a different question. Fernetti, at the session, I need you to be in that room. I need you to be there, and I need you to be ready to stand up and object if Havel deviates from the procedural order. A long silence. She could hear him breathing. She could hear him thinking about what standing up in that room cost. The specific calculation of a man who had spent a career surviving by being careful about when he stood up and when he stayed seated. If I object, he said slowly, and Alessandro still controls the session, then you'll have objected, she said, on the record, which is different from not objecting. She paused. And the record is going to matter, Fernetti. It's going to matter for a long time after this session is over. She kept her voice even. I'm not asking you to put yourself between a man and a bullet. I'm asking you to say, out loud, in a formal setting, what you already know to be true. That's all. Another silence. Then quietly, all right. She let him go. She looked at Brennan. He was standing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and was reading this one accurately. He handed her a cup. She took it. 4 days, she said. 3.5, Brennan said. The session starts at 9. She drank the coffee. It was bad coffee, the kind produced by a machine that had been running without cleaning for too long, and it tasted like what it was. Fuel, not comfort. She drank it anyway. She did not sleep again that night. Alessandro knew about the filing by 6:15 in the morning. Soren confirmed it. The board notification had gone to Havel as commission liaison of record, which meant Havel had called Alessandro before he called anyone else. Because whatever Havel was, he was still rational enough to understand that the man paying him needed to be the first to know when the walls started moving. Alessandro stood in the kitchen of the estate with his phone in his hand and the specific, controlled quality of a man who had trained himself not to show the thing he was actually feeling, because the thing he was actually feeling was not something he had felt in a long time. He had felt anger before. He had felt the cold particular focus of someone who had been challenged and was formulating a response. He had not felt the specific combination of those things when the challenge was coming from the direction he had spent 20 years considering fully secured. He called Drock at 6:30. Drock answered immediately, which told him Havel had already called Drock, which meant his circle was intact, which meant the next 72 hours were still controllable if he moved correctly. She filed everything, Alessandro said. I know. Drock's voice was the voice of a 70-year-old man who had seen many versions of this kind of morning. How much is documented? Enough. He said it the way he would have said it to anyone, as a statement of operational reality, not as an admission. The Renner document is in there. His standing will be flagged before the session. So you need me to second the motion? Yes. A pause. Drock breathed. He was a man who breathed deliberately, who had the bodily habits of someone who had learned that physical control communicated power. And the filing itself. Can we challenge the admissibility? Havel can slow the evidence review. He can argue procedural irregularities in the submission format. It won't hold forever, but it doesn't need to. It just needs to hold long enough for the ratification motion to pass. Alessandro was moving through the kitchen now, the phone to his ear, thinking through the sequence with the automatic speed of someone who had been doing this kind of contingency mapping since before dawn. If the motion passes before the evidence is formally entered, the charter restructure is valid regardless of what the documents say. That's the rule. I know the rule, Drock said. I wrote part of it. Then you understand why it has to happen in the first hour. I understand. A pause. Alessandro, the chair offer, after this is resolved. It stands. I want it in writing, before the session. Alessandro stopped walking. He looked at the window. The morning was gray and cold, and the tree line was the color of something that had given up. He thought about what it meant that Drock wanted it in writing. Not the commitment itself, which he had already made, but the specific need for paper, for a document, for something that could be used later. He thought about whether Drock was taking out insurance or simply being the cautious institutional man he had always been. He decided it didn't matter. He needed Drock in that room, standing up on the right side at the right moment, And if paper was what it cost, then paper was what he'd provide. "You'll have it today," he said. He ended the call. He put the phone in his pocket. He went upstairs to the room that had been the secondary office, the one with the new lock. And he stood in the doorway and looked at the empty shelves where the original documents had been. Soren had moved everything. The room felt like a place something had happened in, the particular blankness of a space that has been deliberately emptied. He stood there for a moment. Then he closed the door. At 8 that morning, Lila attempted to access the estate's secondary server from a remote location. She had the partial key from the flash drive, and 3 hours before the system's security protocol would register an external access attempt and notify Soren. She sat in a rented room with a laptop and a second phone, and her coat still on because the heat in the room didn't work. And she worked through the decryption sequence with the methodical focus of someone who understood that the margin for error was effectively 0. The access held for 47 minutes. She pulled 31 documents. The decryption was incomplete. She got the file names and partial content on about 2/3 of them, full content on 11. She encrypted everything she pulled onto a separate drive, wiped the access log as thoroughly as the partial key allowed her to, and closed the connection. She called Vivian at 8:52. Vivian took the call in the car on the way back from a meeting with Carla that had run until 8:30. She listened to Lila's account of what she'd pulled. She asked 3 specific questions about the 11 fully decrypted documents. Lila answered them. When the call ended, Vivian sat with the phone in her lap and looked at the road and thought about one of the 11 documents, the one that was not about money or charter mechanics or commission manipulation. The one that was a communication between Alessandro and a man named Vogel, who was not a syndicate figure, who was an external contractor, and whose specific area of work was the preparation of identity documentation and the arrangement of what the communication described, in Alessandro's own phrasing, as clean exit architecture. Alessandro had been building himself an exit, a clean one, documented, prepared, with new papers and a transfer destination, dated 8 months ago, before any of the commission maneuvering, before the forgeries were complete, before the charter restructure plan was finalized. He had been planning to take what he could extract and disappear. The ratification and the charter restructure were not the end game. They were the mechanism for the extraction. He would ratify the charter change, consolidate the authority, liquidate the pledged assets into a form he could move, and then he would leave. Leave the syndicate. Leave the organization. Leave whatever was left of it after he'd taken what he needed. He had never been planning to run the Moretti Syndicate as its sole authority. He had been planning to hollow it out and walk away from the shell. She thought about what that meant for the people she had been protecting, the workers, the legitimate businesses, the family allies, the capos who were not part of Alessandro's arrangement. She had been trying to protect the organization from his consolidation of power. She had not understood that the organization was not what he was after. He was after the money, and then he was going to be gone. She called Brennan. She told him about Vogel. She heard the silence on the other end of the phone that meant he was doing the same recalculation she had done. "He's going to try to move assets before the session," Brennan said. "He might already be moving them." She thought about the timeline. The ratification motion is the legal cover. It legitimizes the asset transfer. But if he can move enough before the session, the ratification is just insurance. She looked at the road. "I need the Ashcroft financial holds extended to the secondary accounts. All of them. Today. Some of those accounts have syndicate operational funds. Legitimate payroll, supplier contracts. I know. Flag them separately so we can restore them quickly after. But I need everything frozen that can be frozen before Alessandro's people start moving wire transfers." She paused. "And I need Carla to add the Vogel document to the Integrity Board filing. Supplemental submission. Today." "Vivian!" Brennan's voice had the weight of someone about to say the thing he'd been holding. "If you freeze the operational accounts, the capos with legitimate operations are going to feel it. Some of them are going to think you're the one destabilizing the organization. I know. That's the narrative Alessandro's been pushing, that you're conducting a hostile takeover. I know, Brennan." Her voice was controlled. "Barely. And the counter to that narrative is that I unfreeze those accounts the moment the session is over and the restructure is blocked, and the people whose payroll ran normally don't have a grievance, and the ones who lost money in a wire transfer that Alessandro ordered do. She looked at the window. It's not clean. None of this is clean. But the alternative is watching him walk out of this with everything he extracted and the commission finding him in compliance, and I am not going to do that. She heard Brennan breathe. Then, I'll make the calls. The next 3 days were a kind of sustained physical and psychological attrition that Vivian had not experienced before, even in the hardest negotiations of her professional life, because those negotiations had had defined endpoints, defined locations, defined parameters. These 3 days had none of those things. They had a moving target, an opponent who was operating through intermediaries across multiple channels simultaneously, and the specific exhaustion of someone who was sleeping in 3-hour increments and waking each time to a phone with new information that required immediate processing and response. Alessandro moved on the secondary accounts on the second day. His people hit 4 wire transfer points within a 90-minute window, coordinated, fast, the product of planning. 3 of the 4 were frozen before they cleared. The 4th moved partial funds into an account structure that Carla's team spent 6 hours tracing before they found the destination and had it flagged with the board. Vivian received the report on the 4th account at 2 in the morning and sat with it for a long time. The destination account had Lila Moreau's name on it. The move had been timed to occur on the same day Lila's cooperation with the Ashcroft Group became known to the syndicate's internal network, which meant it had been sitting in Alessandro's contingency plan, ready to execute the moment Lila's defection registered, framing her as the recipient of extracted funds. One more layer of the exit architecture, one more body positioned between Alessandro and accountability. She called Lila. Lila picked up on the second ring, which meant she was awake, which meant she already knew. He used the account, Lila said. Her voice was flat. We have the transfer flagged. The board will see it as part of the supplemental filing. Vivian kept her voice steady. It won't stick. The timing makes the setup obvious. To someone who's looking for it, a pause. What about the commission members who already want to believe I'm the source of this? They'll see the same timing. Vivian paused. Lila, I need you to be at the session, in the room, as a witness of record. A silence that had the texture of a woman standing at the edge of something. If I'm in that room, you're protected by the session record. Nothing can happen to you in a formal commission session. She paused. And what you have to say in that room, the account movements, the Vogel communication, the documents you pulled, it changes what that session is. It's not a he said, she said charter dispute anymore. It's a documented criminal conspiracy against the commission itself. Her voice was quiet, but without softness. Alessandro built this to erase both of us, Lila. I'm asking you to stand in the room and not be erased. A long silence. What time does it start? Lila said. The session was held in a commission property 2 hours outside the city, a large formal room with a long table and chairs that had been designed to communicate institutional permanence, the kind of room that said decisions made here have weight and history. Vivian arrived 40 minutes early with Brennan and Carla and 2 members of the Ashcroft Council. She was dressed in the dark suit she wore for the most significant negotiations of her professional life, the one that communicated nothing except absolute seriousness of purpose, and she stood at the window of the anteroom and looked at the gray morning outside and felt the 3 days of accumulated exhaustion sitting in her back and her jaw and behind her eyes, and she did not let it touch her face. Alessandro arrived 20 minutes later. She saw his car from the window. He came in through the main entrance with Soren and 2 others, and he walked with the particular deliberate ease of a man who was performing confidence, the specific body language of someone who needed the room to believe he was certain before the room gave him cause for certainty. She had seen that walk before. In other men. In other rooms. She knew what it meant. It meant he was not certain. Havel opened the session at 9:03. He was a compact man with a face that communicated very little, the face of someone who had learned to keep his expressions in the range of professional neutrality because his professional neutrality was, in fact, for sale. He went through the procedural opening with the efficiency of someone who had done it many times, and Vivian watched him from her seat across the table and thought about the correspondence. His name in Alessandro's margin notes, the specific arrangements that had been made, and she kept her face still. The session is called to address the formal challenge filed by the Ashcroft Group regarding the Moretti Charter and associated financial operations, Havel said. The filing party holds the floor first per commission procedure. He looked at Vivian. Mrs. Before the floor is opened, Alessandro said. Havel stopped. The room went very quiet. Alessandro was sitting 3 seats from Havel, and he leaned forward slightly when he spoke, not standing, not making a performance of it, just the measured redirect of a man who had decided to move early. I'd like to invoke Procedural Rule 47, emergency ratification of a charter amendment currently under formal challenge. The amendment has been prepared and is ready for vote. He looked down the table. I request a second. Havel's mouth opened. Capo-Renner's standing is under integrity review, Carla said immediately, loudly, across the table. Filed 2 days ago. His second is procedurally void. Alessandro looked at Drock. Drock was sitting 4 chairs down, 67 years old, with the expression of a man who had decided what he was going to do and was now doing it. He drew a breath. He opened his mouth. Fernetti stood up. He was not a physically commanding man, heavy-set, deliberate in his movements, with the look of someone who had been calculating the cost of this moment for 72 hours and had arrived at an answer he had not fully wanted. He stood up and he put his hands flat on the table and he said, in the specific voice of a man reading from the floor, I object to the emergency ratification motion on the grounds that the amendment document referenced in the motion contains assets pledged without proper charter authority. Specifically, the Ashcroft Eastern Holdings, pledged in the name of the joint charter without the documented consent of the co-holding party. He kept his hands on the table. His voice did not shake. This is a procedural objection under Article 19. It requires the motion to be stayed pending review. The room erupted. Not loudly. Commission rooms did not have the kind of eruptions that involved shouting. They had the eruption of 6 people all speaking at once in controlled voices, of chairs moving, of Havel's gavel coming down twice, of Alessandro turning to look at Fernetti with the specific quality of attention that was not anger, but something beneath anger, colder and more permanent. Fernetti looked back at him. He did not sit down. Vivian sat still in her chair. Her hands were folded on the table. She was looking at Havel, who was looking at his own procedural notes with the expression of a man who had been handed a problem he had not prepared for, because the objection was valid, and he knew it was valid, and the room knew it was valid, and processing it any other way was going to put his name next to Alessandro's on a document that was already in front of the Integrity Board. The objection is noted, Havel said finally. His voice had the quality of a man choosing carefully. The motion is stayed pending procedural review of the charter amendment documentation. He looked at his hands. He looked at Alessandro. He looked away. The floor returns to the filing party. Vivian stood. The room settled. Alessandro was looking at her, and she looked back at him across the width of the table. And in that moment, there was nothing between them except 22 feet of old wood and 19 years and the specific weight of everything that had been built and dismantled and documented and forged and frozen and transferred and exposed in the last 10 days. And she felt none of it on her face because her face was not the place where any of this was happening anymore. She picked up the first document. The commission has received the Ashcroft filing, she said. I'm going to walk through it in order. I want every person in this room to understand the specific sequence of decisions that brought us here, and I want that understanding to be on the record before any further procedural motions are introduced. She looked around the table. The first document is dated 26 months ago. It is a communication between Don Alessandro Moretti and Commission Liaison Havel, and it describes, in Alessandro's own words, the terms of an arrangement that would... Alessandro's chair scraped back. This is not a valid evidentiary proceeding, he said. Standing now, his voice controlled but with something moving underneath it, the specific quality of a man who has watched his architecture take hits and is now standing in the room deciding whether to defend it or burn it. The filing was submitted outside normal procedure. The board review is not complete. You don't have authority to enter these documents into the record until she... The board review is not required for documents to be read into the session record, Carla said, not standing, not raising her voice. It's required for documents to be used as basis for a formal commission finding. Reading is different from finding. She can read. Alessandro looked at Havel. Havel was looking at the table. Vivian watched Alessandro look at Havel. She watched Havel not look back. She watched something happen in Alessandro's face in that moment. A very small thing, a shift of barely a millimeter in the set of his jaw. The specific expression of a man who has just understood that a piece he believed was in place is... Havel did not look up. That was the moment. Not the filing, not the documents, not the 3 days of frozen accounts and supplemental submissions and Frenetti standing up with his hands flat on the table. The moment was Havel looking at the wood grain of the commission table while Alessandro waited for eye contact that did not come, and the room understood in the particular way that rooms full of people who have spent their lives reading power dynamics understood, that the arrangement had changed, that the man who had built the session to deliver a specific outcome was now sitting in a session that was delivering a different one, and that the people he had paid for their positions in this room had made a calculation that the cost of holding those positions had exceeded the value of what they'd been offered. Vivian read the first document into the record. Her voice was even and without theater. She did not editorialize. She did not pause for effect. She read Alessandro's own words in Alessandro's own sequence. The communication with Havel from 26 months ago, and the room was very quiet while she read. The specific quiet of people absorbing information they had suspected existed and were now hearing, confirmed in the voice of the woman it had been designed to destroy. When she finished the first document, she set it down and picked up the second. Alessandro sat down. It was a small thing, that sitting. It was not surrender. She understood that. He was recalibrating, buying time, letting her read while he thought through what remained available to him. But the act of sitting, after having stood to challenge her, after having looked at Havel and been met with the table, communicated something to every person in the room that no speech could have communicated. She kept reading. She read for 40 minutes. Every document in sequence. The Kessler routing, the forged authorizations, the Havel correspondence, the Dreisen pressure material, the Renner bribe, and then, last, the Vogel communication, the clean exit architecture, the prepared identity documents, the transfer destination. She read it the same way she had read everything else. Flat, precise, without embellishment. She let the content perform itself. When she finished the Vogel document, she set it down with the others and looked at the commission members around the table and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "He was not planning to lead this organization as its sole authority. He was planning to take what he could move and leave." She looked at each face in turn. Everyone in this room who made an arrangement with him, the chair, the territories, the legal infrastructure, those arrangements were made with a man who had no intention of honoring them. The assets he pledged do not belong to him. The positions he promised are not his to give. And the organization you were told you would benefit from, he was planning to hand you the shell of it and disappear. She picked up the Vogel document one more time and set it at the center of the table. That's what's in front of you. The room was quiet for a long time. Druck spoke first. He was 67 years old and he had been in commission rooms since before most of the people at this table had their positions, and his voice, when he finally used it, had the particular weight of a man who understood that what he said next was going to be part of a record that would outlast him. I want to state for the session record that the second I was prepared to offer on the emergency ratification motion is withdrawn. He did not look at Alessandro. He looked at Havel. I also want to state that the offer made to me in exchange for that second, the commission chair, was made using an asset that the Don did not have standing to pledge. A pause. I was misled about the nature of the arrangement. It was not a confession. It was a repositioning, the specific language of an experienced institutional man finding the version of events that kept him on the right side of the record. Vivian understood that. She did not require it to be more than what it was. Havel sat with his hands on the table for a moment after Druck finished. Then he said, to no one in particular, in the voice of a man who had arrived at a position and was choosing his words with great care, The commission will recess for 1 hour to allow members to review the documentation entered into record. He looked at the gavel in his hand as if he had forgotten it was there. He put it down. When we reconvene, the commission will address the Integrity Board's findings regarding the charter filings and take appropriate action. He did not look at Alessandro when he said appropriate action. He did not need to. The phrase sat in the room on its own. Alessandro stood up when the recess was called. He walked to the side door of the session room without speaking to anyone, not to Soren, who was standing near the back wall, not to the two capos who had come with him and were now very carefully not making eye contact with each other. He went through the side door, and Vivian watched him go and felt something she had not expected, which was not satisfaction and was not relief and was not the closing of a chapter. It was closer to grief, the particular grief of someone who has spent a long time understanding what a thing actually was and has finally stopped pretending it was something else. She stayed at the table during the recess. Brennan brought her water. Carla was reviewing the session transcript on her tablet. Lila was sitting at the far end of the table, where she had been since the session opened, and she had said nothing during the reading, had sat with her hands folded and her face composed in the particular stillness of a woman who had already made her choices and was now waiting to live in the consequences of them. Vivian looked at her. Lila looked back. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that required saying. Vivian drank her water and looked at the documents stacked on the table in front of her. The physical objects that she had spent 4 months assembling and 3 days filing and 40 minutes reading into a record that would now exist regardless of what happened next. She thought about her mother's silk robe, which was still somewhere in the bedroom of the estate, folded over a chair or pushed to the floor, and she thought about the brass lamp from Lyon, and she thought about the specific feeling of standing in the corridor with the phone in her hand and the 2-inch gap of amber light, and she understood that she had not been deciding what to do in that moment. She had already decided. She had decided weeks before that, and the corridor had simply been the place where she stopped pretending she hadn't. When the commission reconvened 53 minutes later, Havel's manner had changed. The change was subtle. The difference between a man performing procedural neutrality and a man performing procedural neutrality because he understood that performing it poorly had a specific, documented cost. He was more careful, more formal. He moved through the procedural steps with the precision of someone who was aware that the session transcript was going to be read by people who were looking for deviation. The commission's findings took 3 hours. They were not delivered all at once. They came in the sequential, methodical way of institutional findings. Each element addressed in turn, cited to the documentation, recorded with the language of formal determination. The forged authorizations were found to be in breach of the Charter's signatory requirements. The Kessler routing was found to be an unauthorized expansion in violation of territorial agreements. The Havel correspondence was referred to the Integrity Board for separate proceedings. The Renner arrangement was found to constitute a prohibited offer to a commission member. The Dreysen pressure was entered into the findings record without a formal determination because the evidence was sufficient to support a finding, but Havel, for reasons that were not stated in the record and did not need to be, moved to table that specific element for a subsequent session, and nobody pushed him. The Vogel document was entered into the record with a commission determination that it demonstrated premeditated intent to misappropriate charter assets, which was the specific phrase that carried the specific weight of the commission's enforcement authority. And then the commission voted on the charter. The vote was 7-2 to suspend Alessandro Moretti's authority as Don of the Moretti Syndicate, pending the completion of a formal restructuring process to be administered by a commission-appointed oversight body. The 2 dissenting votes were from capos who had not spoken during the session and who Vivian expected would be the subject of their own integrity proceedings within the month. The 7 were enough. Alessandro was in the room when the vote was read. He had come back through the side door 40 minutes into the reconvened session without Soren and had sat in his chair and listened to the findings with the expression of a man who had decided that expression was the only thing he had left to control. When the vote count was read, he did not react visibly. He sat with it the way a man sits with a sentence, not processing it exactly, more receiving it, letting it become real in the specific cellular way that irreversible things become real. Vivian did not look at him when the vote was read. She looked at the table. When the session was formally closed and the room began to move, people standing, Chairs scraping, the low register sound of institutional proceedings ending. Alessandro walked to her side of the table. She had known he would. She had been waiting for it without quite naming it to herself, the specific wait of 19 years requiring something other than a commission vote to close. He stopped 3 feet from her. He looked at her, and she looked at him. And the room moved around them, people careful to give them distance, the room understanding without being told that this was not the business of the session. He looked older than he had 3 days ago. It was not the dramatic aging of crisis, not theatrical. It was something more basic, the specific appearance of a man who has been running something that required constant energy to maintain, and who has stopped running it, and in the stopping has become visible as a person rather than a position. "You could have come to me," he said. She looked at him. "You were already building the exit, Alessandro. You were building it 8 months before I found the files." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked away. "I thought you'd take it all," he said. "I thought your family. I thought that's what this was. That you'd been waiting for the opening." "I know you thought that." Her voice was even, without heat. The anger she had carried through 4 months and 3 days and 40 minutes of reading documents into a record was not gone. It was present, but it had settled into something that was no longer useful as fuel because there was nothing left to drive. "You thought that because it's what you would have done, and because you never looked at what I was actually doing." She picked up her briefcase from the floor beside the chair. "You never looked, Alessandro, for 19 years. He did not answer that. She walked past him. She walked to the door and through it and into the corridor and out of the commission building into the cold afternoon air, and she stopped on the steps and breathed it, the specific cold of a late afternoon in early winter, the kind of cold that had a clarity to it, that took away the recycled air of formal rooms and the smell of old wood and institutional carpeting and replaced it with something that moved. Brennan was beside her a moment later. He did not say anything. He stood next to her and they both looked at the parking area and the gray sky above the tree line and the particular quality of the light, and after a moment she exhaled slowly, and it was a different exhalation than the ones that had been available to her for the last 4 months. Something in it released. Not everything, but enough. "The oversight body convenes in 3 weeks, Brennan said. "I know. They'll want your input on the restructure proposal." "I know." She looked at the tree line. "The proposal is already written. I wrote the first draft 2 months ago." She had not told him that. She could see him absorbing it with the particular patience of a man who had stopped being surprised by the depth of her preparation. "I want the syndicate's financial infrastructure converted to a legitimate holding structure over 24 months. Independent counsel, rotating leadership, no single authority. The capos who have legitimate operations keep them. The ones who were in Alessandro's arrangement go through the board's proceeding." She paused. "The Eastern estate goes back into the Ashcroft Trust. The assets he pledged without authorization are unwound. The Ligurian accounts are closed, and the funds are remitted to the parties who were owed." She looked at him. "And the building on the estate property, the secondary office wing, I want it repurposed." Brennan waited. "A training facility," she said, "for the next generation of people who are going to run whatever this becomes, financial discipline, organizational ethics, the mechanics of legitimate governance." She said it without idealism, without the elevated tone of a woman announcing a vision. She said it the way she said everything, as a practical determination, a decision made with her eyes open to the difficulty of executing it. "If you don't teach people how to build something real, they'll build the thing Alessandro built. Because the thing Alessandro built is the thing that comes naturally when you don't have a better model." She picked up her bag. "We're going to give them a better model." Brennan looked at her for a long moment. "That's going to take years." "I know. Some of the capos won't accept it. Some of them will leave, some of them will adjust. The ones who adjust are the ones worth building with." She walked down the steps toward the car. "The ones who leave are going to find that the territories they thought they owned are a lot harder to operate without the financial infrastructure they've been taking for granted." She opened the car door. "They'll come back." He followed her. And Lila. She had been waiting for that. She got into the car and set her bag on the seat beside her and thought about Lila Moreau, who was somewhere behind them in the commission building, navigating the specific aftermath of a woman who had helped dismantle something she had also helped build. The Integrity Board will have questions for her. She'll answer them. She cooperated, and that cooperation is documented. She looked out the window. After the board is done with her, what she does is her own decision. I'm not her guardian. Brennan got in beside her. The driver started the car. The commission building moved past the window and then the parking area, and then they were on the road through the trees, and Vivian leaned her head back against the seat and looked at the roof of the car and let the movement do something to the accumulated weight of the last 4 months that stillness couldn't. She thought about the session, about Fernetti standing up with his hands flat on the table, about Drock withdrawing his second, about Havel looking at the wood grain and making the calculation that his arrangement was no longer worth what it had been worth an hour before. She thought about how none of those things had been certain. She had not known Fernetti would stand. She had believed he would, had prepared the ground as carefully as she could, but she had not known. And Drock had been closer to seconding the motion than anyone in that room understood. She had seen the breath he drew before Fernetti rose, the specific preparation of a man about to speak, and she had felt something in her chest that was very close to the edge of her control before Fernetti's chair moved. She had planned for almost everything. She had not been able to plan past the specific moment in which another person decided to act with integrity under pressure. You could not plan that. You could only create the conditions in which it became the easier choice, and then you had to trust that it was enough. It had been enough. Barely. She thought about barely. She thought about Alessandro on the estate steps in the morning, the way he had looked standing in the parking area when the commission's security personnel had escorted him to his car at the close of the session. Not handcuffed. The commission's authority was organizational, not criminal, and whatever criminal proceedings followed would be a separate process and would take longer. He had walked to his car under his own power, with the deliberate pacing of a man refusing to allow the moment to diminish him visually. She had seen it from across the parking area. She had watched him get in and the door close and the car pull away, and she had watched it go and felt the specific complicated ache of a person watching something end that has occupied the center of their life for a long time. She did not wish him anything. That surprised her a little. She had expected, at some point in this process, to locate either the desire to destroy him or the desire for him to understand what he had thrown away. She had found neither. What she found instead, watching his car leave the commission parking area, was something closer to exhaustion and the particular clarity that comes after exhaustion. The stripped-down perception of someone who has spent too long in the heat of something and has finally come out of it and can see, in the cooler air on the other side, what was real and what was performance. What was real, he had been building an exit for 8 months. He had never believed in the thing they were building together. He had never believed in her as a partner in anything, had believed her to be a resource, a structure, a financial function wrapped in a marriage. And he had been wrong about that for 19 years and had never once looked closely enough to find out. What was performance? The grief she had been managing. The specific sorrow she had been carrying since the first document arrived in February. The sorrow that felt like mourning a marriage. She had been mourning something that had not existed in the form she was mourning it. You could not mourn a thing that never was. What you could do was grieve the version of it you had believed in, and she had given herself the time in the car on the Eastern Ridge Road and in the Ashcroft study at 4 a.m. and in 3-hour increments of sleep over 3 days to do that, quietly, without performance, and she thought she had mostly finished it. Mostly. The car took the Ridge Road home, the same road the driver had taken the night she came back from the airport. The mountain curve and the tree line and the headlights cutting across the dark. She watched it go past and thought about the woman who had ridden this road 3 weeks ago with her carry-on and her briefcase and the dense, quiet weight of a closed deal behind her sternum. That woman had still been operating in the version of reality in which the worst thing she was going to find in the bedroom was the thing she found. Had not yet fully understood that the bedroom was only the surface of what had been prepared for her. She had understood it within 24 hours. That was not nothing. She got back to the Ashcroft property at 7 p.m. The household staff had left dinner on the kitchen table. Something simple, the kind of meal that communicated that someone had thought about what she needed without requiring her to ask for it. She sat down and ate it without ceremony, without the phone, without the files. She ate because she had not eaten properly in 3 days, and her body was providing the information about that in unambiguous terms. Brennan sat across from her and ate the same meal, and they did not talk about the session or the restructure or the next steps. They talked about nothing, the specific relief of talking about nothing. A property dispute in the Ashcroft Western Holdings that had been running for 2 years and was almost resolved. A book Brennan had been reading in the hour before bed when he could manage to get to bed at a reasonable time. The quality of the coffee from the estate's machine versus the quality of the coffee from the property on the ridge. After dinner, she walked the property. It was full dark by then, cold and clear, and she walked the perimeter of the east garden with her hands in her coat pockets, and her breath making small temporary shapes in the cold air. The garden had been her mother's design. Not this garden exactly, but this garden's bones, the structure that had been maintained and built on over the years, the original plantings that were still here under the winter mulch. She had not thought about that in a long time. She thought about it now. The way certain structures persisted because they had been built with care in the first place, because someone had taken the time to put the right things in the right places with the long view in mind, not the immediate appearance. She stood in the cold for a long time. She thought about the training facility, the east wing of the estate, which Alessandro had used for the secondary office, stripped and repurposed, the locks changed, the shelves cleared of the documents he had kept there, and filled instead with something else. The documentation of a different way of doing things, the material evidence that organizations could be built without the specific architecture of fear and arrangement that had kept the Moretti Syndicate running for 20 years. She did not think this would be easy. She did not think that people who came to that building would arrive without the habits of mind that had been formed in the old structure. She thought it would be slow and difficult, and that some of what she was trying to build would fail and have to be rebuilt, and she thought that was acceptable. Failure that you could document and learn from was not the same as failure that was hidden and repeated. She went back inside. She called Carla. Carla was still at her office, working through the session transcript and the next steps on the Integrity Board referrals. They talked for 20 minutes about timeline and sequencing and the specific documents that would need to be prepared for the oversight body's first meeting. It was the conversation of two people doing a job they knew how to do, and there was a quality of normalcy in it that Vivian found more restorative than she had expected. The specific normality of competent work, of a problem that had a structure and a process and a set of tools adequate to address it. When she ended the call, she sat in the study with the lights low and the files in front of her, and she did not open them. She sat with them the way you sit with things you will need to look at in the morning, but do not need to look at tonight. And she let herself be in the room without purpose for a little while, which was something she had not allowed herself in a long time. Her phone lit up with a number she did not recognize. She let it ring. It stopped. It rang again. She looked at it. She answered. It was Alessandro. He was calling from a different number, not the commission property line, not his personal mobile, something borrowed or purchased. She could hear the specific background quality of a car interior, the slight compression of a closed space. She did not speak first. "I need you to know something," he said. She waited. "I knew what you were." His voice was different from every version of it she had heard in the last 10 days. The annoyance in the bedroom, the controlled damage management on the phone, the studied composure in the commission room. This was something older, something underneath all of those. From the beginning, I knew what your family was and what you were capable of, and I knew what you brought to this. A pause. "I just thought I was smarter than it." She sat with that for a moment. The specific admission of a man who had stripped away everything except the one thing he could say without arrangement or strategy. And this was what was underneath. Not love, not regret exactly, not the apology she would have needed him to make years ago when it might have meant something. Just the acknowledgement, 19 years late, that he had seen her clearly and had chosen to treat her as if he hadn't. "I know," she said. He was quiet for a long time. "The exit," she said. "The Vogel arrangement. Were you planning to tell me before you left?" Another long silence. The silence was its own answer, and they both understood it. "Take care of yourself, Alessandro," she said. She ended the call. She set the phone face down on the desk. She looked at the window, the dark glass, the reflection of the room, her own face in it, older than she thought of it as being, carrying what the last 4 months had deposited in the skin around her eyes and the set of her jaw. She looked at it for a moment without apology or assessment, just looked. Then she reached for the files. There was work to do in the morning. There had been work to do every morning for 4 months, and there would be work to do every morning for the next 2 years while the restructure was built and tested and adjusted and built again. She knew how to do this work. She had always known how to do this work. The difference was that now she would do it without the specific ongoing cost of pretending she was something other than what she was. The financial intelligence of the Moretti Syndicate, the structural engineer of everything it had relied on to survive. The woman who had built it quietly from the inside and had now, quietly, rebuilt it into something that could not be owned by a single person because she had made sure it couldn't. Her name would be on the restructure documents. Her actual name, her actual signature, the one she wrote herself. She opened the first file. Outside, the cold had settled fully into the ridge, and the trees had the particular stillness of winter that is not absence but patience, everything beneath the surface doing what it does in the dark, maintaining the structure of things that will be visible again in the spring, in the new growth that comes from roots that were never touched by what happened above the ground. She read until midnight, then she closed the files, turned off the light, and slept. Not in 3-hour increments, not with the phone face up, not with the specific braced quality of someone waiting for the next thing to break. She slept the way she had not slept in 4 months, which was to say completely, which was to say without architecture, which was to say like someone who had finished the thing she had set out to do and had arrived without ceremony at the other side of it. In the morning, there would be work. Tonight there was only this, the dark, the cold, the quiet of a house that belonged to her family, the faint sound of wind in the trees on the ridge, and the particular stillness of a woman who had not been erased.